Hello, and welcome to this quick overview of some of the concepts from Module 7, which deals with the conscious self. This is a very interesting module and contains a lot of information about how we understand ourselves and how that, and in knowing about that, we can think about how that impacts our mental models and how we interact with the world around us. So it's interesting to think about. It gets a little deep and philosophical, so there are some links in here where you can go to think about this at an even deeper level than the textbook if you'd like. I'll try to keep it brief and just cover some highlights to kind of guide your reading and point out some of the main points that might be relevant to you as educators. Okay, in terms of consciousness and developing a conscious self, one thing that's important is knowing when we understand ourselves to be a self or an individual. And that starts in infancy, and there's research about how we distinguish ourselves from others. William James is sometimes known as the father of some major ideas in psychology, and I actually just heard a podcast about him yesterday where he had quite an interesting and difficult life through it, early adulthood, until he became very famous as a psychologist for his ideas on the development of sense of self. But he proposed the idea that there's a thing called the self as knower, where we're aware of ourselves and we consider ourselves a being. And there's some interesting questions posed here that I've taken from our author to consider. Consider you know that you're yourself, but what if you lost a piece of your body or your quote-unquote self? Well, how much could you lose before you were still you and still know and recognize yourself as yourself? That's kind of an interesting question to contemplate. So if you lost your foot, of course you'd still be you. If you lost, a bigger part of your body, you'd still be you. But at what point do you not become yourself? And that kind of gets at what creates the self. So it's just an interesting philosophical angle to think about understanding ourselves. Okay, knowing ourselves involves two central internal qualities, being conscious and having a will, or motivation relates to the idea of will to do things and recognize that we're capable of doing that. Some concepts to help understand the self as a knower are the ideas of a dialogical self, in which the theory would posit that we basically have dialogues within ourselves. We can recognize others' perspectives and ours and almost have a dialogue. So we can think something and then think, well, this person's going to react to this way, and then I'm going to react to that another way, and almost have a conversation within our heads. And that kind of relates a little bit to the idea of private speech if you study cognitive development in ED 601 and Vygotsky's ideas about private speech. But in this concept of dialogical self, you're actually having an internal dialogue. Infants probably are not capable of doing this, but it develops over time and through our interactions with the world and ourselves. So you can see how that relates to our development of mental models that we talked about in the prior module. Another concept that relates to our understanding ourselves as knowers is the idea of sentience, and that refers to the internal subjective experience of what it's like to be someone. And that's interesting too. As I said, infants develop the idea that they're separate from their caregivers in infancy. And that's important and related to this. And another related area of study or application to this concept of sentience is recognizing ourselves as a being or someone. It relates to animal studies as well. So there's a link here for you to just consider this concept of sentience, and it lists which animals have consciousness or sentience and which ones don't. I'm not saying it's 100% accurate, but it's certainly something to think about, and this concept does come up in animal rights advocacy because obviously if something is sentient, it can experience things like pain and suffering, and as humans, if you're humane, you wouldn't want to impose that on another being. So it's a related issue, just something for you to think about. In terms of Freud's ideas, this topic, the conscious self, is very relevant. He definitely talked about the idea of having a conscious and unconscious part of our mental being, and some of his work describes the ego as relating to consciousness and being an internal sense organ, if you will, and that he talked about the idea that we use defense mechanisms to protect consciousness from thoughts that are too painful for it to experience, and that there's a level called the preconscious that has information that is retrievable and thought about in rational terms, but maybe not always at the forefront of our thinking or actions, and that there's something called access to motility that's carried out through the brain's body homunculus, which is the sensory motor cortex. So it relates kind of our action to our thinking at a maybe less than totally conscious level. So just some ideas to think about how Freud thought the ego worked and what its function was. In addition to the ego, he developed the idea that there are some other psychological structures we'll talk about in just a moment. In terms of thinking about consciousness in people, it's kind of a deep concept. It's interesting. Julian Jaynes believed that there were no indications of self-reflection before 400 BC. So it's interesting to think that if you look back at the way people wrote and the way people related stories in history, self-reflection wasn't a big piece of that way early on. One theory is that before that, people heard voices in their heads and thought they were from the gods, not their own thinking. Back to Freud for one moment. Here's a link to a source that talks about consciousness and unconsciousness in Freud's theory, and it's an iceberg model. And I have another one on the next slide that I'll show you. They're a little bit different, but they depict the idea that some of our mental activity is not readily accessible to us, or accessible at all consciously. So here's a picture of the iceberg model and a link to where this one came from. And it talks about the mental constructs that Freud developed, the idea that we have an ego, an id, and a superego that work in concert and sometimes against each other to result in our thoughts and actions. This is kind of a neat model for understanding Freud's ideas because it's fairly straightforward and simple to understand. So the water level here would be covering most of the iceberg, and only the tip of the iceberg is in our consciousness. So we're somewhat aware of preconscious material, part of how our ego is operating and using information is conscious, and we recognize our current thoughts and perceptions. But our memories that are stored and things that are painful and stored that we don't want to deal with, we're not really readily able to access. And then there's some things that are just influencing us, but we're not aware of them. So part of the idea of psychodynamic or psychoanalytically based therapy is to develop some insights to modify our behavior. If we recognize patterns in the way we act, we can theorize about what's underlying those patterns that we might not be conscious of, change those patterns, and maybe function better in society. So anyway, this is an example of the iceberg model. It'll make more sense when you do the readings and really think about this idea of consciousness and unconsciousness. And there is a slight difference between this model and the figure in our textbook. So just take a peek there and see if you can recognize what's a little different. And I'm not exactly sure which one's 100% correct, but they're theoretical models and they convey the same ideas in general terms. Okay, back to consciousness. I'm going kind of quickly here because I don't want to make this too long. In terms of its evolution, when did we become conscious? If we weren't very conscious of ourselves and self-reflective really early on in history, why did we become conscious and how? Modern consciousness is theorized to have evolved when people recognized that those voices they were hearing in their heads were part of their own minds, not God speaking to them. And I'm not saying God as in, many of our current monotheistic religions think about God, but the gods, like in the Greek mythology and so forth, people made sense of what they were hearing or feeling as messages from the gods. Anyway, they began to realize that might not be what's exactly happening, and they began to monitor, control, and modify those voices themselves, and even in current days, distracting themselves from them if they were painful or stressful. So they began to cope differently with those voices. They interpreted them differently, and then they coped differently with them. A very interesting parallel to the modern concept of cognitive behavioral therapy. We have thoughts, we interpret them a certain way, which dictates our emotions and then our behavior. So actually, that's a very nice parallel. As far as consciousness goes, it's structured in different ways. Sometimes we're very conscious of what we're doing, sometimes we're not. And there's an experience called flow, which is where a person is engaged in complete concentration in the task they're performing. They're not self-conscious or worried about how they look doing that task or how are they doing on that task. They're just really engaged in it, and their action and awareness are merged, and they don't feel a pressure with time or worry about time, and they're very clear on what they're achieving, and they're just moving forward. In terms of work, it's a great experience. That's where you're kind of just immersed in your work and focused and not stressed about external distractions. So on this slide, there's a diagram that talks about the flow experience and what contributes to it. And I have a little note here that this might relate to your construction of curriculum and work for your students. If you think about the instructional level that you're providing work at, if it's too easy at the mastery level, they're not going to learn from it, and they're probably not going to experience flow because they're not challenged and they're not maybe interested. If it's too difficult, they might be frustrated. But if you're in the instructional level where they're challenged but not challenged too much, you might be more likely to bring about the flow experience. So this diagram kind of quantifies how the experience works. So it has two dimensions, the skill level of the person and the challenge of the task. And if the skill level is low and the task is low challenge, they're likely to be able to do it. But if their skill level is low and the task is very challenging, they may be stressed and anxious, so they're not going to experience flow. On the flip side, like I said with the mastery level here, if they're high level of skill, if the person has a high level of skill and the task is boring or doesn't require much, they're going to be unchallenged and bored. But if they're too stressed, that might not be great either. So you want the right degree of stress and skill to correspond with each other. So if you've got a high ability, you can do a more challenging task. If you have lower ability, you can do you'll be able to do less difficult tasks. But if you're right in this middle range, you might be more likely, let's say, to experience flow, depending on what the task is and depending on your own personality, motivations, and interest in the task. So just something to think about when you design your instruction. You want to aim to have a situation where students can really engage in their work, really enjoy it, really apply it to themselves, their personality, their interests, their motivations, and get the most out of it. The readings focus deeply on free will and voluntary action, and I actually did quite a bit of supplementary reading in making this PowerPoint for you, and in keeping it brief, I'm not going to read it to you, but there's some links here for you. In terms of main concepts for the text, it reviews the ideas of determinism versus free will and the history of that, and there are religious backgrounds and differences that considered us to be predetermined versus free to affect our destinies. That was bad grammar, sorry. They determined our destinies to be predetermined or based on our own free will. So there's a history of that in religion and also science. And then in our sorry, I'm flipping back and forth. I'll let you read those examples here, and the textbook does too, provides them. And then there's also a tradition in Western civilization that does feel there is self-determination in our behavior, and that idea makes sense in terms of like the laws. People are responsible for their behavior, but it also conflicts with some aspects of science. So it's a little difficult to say what are people actually freely doing or not. However, to maintain law and order, of course, we do impose some sense of responsibility and accountability on people. So that'll continue to evolve as research proves what we can and can't control. There's a lot of information about this debate of free will and a lot of kind of esoteric but very interesting debate about even the definition of what free means and what will is. So there are some links here, and like I say, I spent quite a bit of time reading about this. Our author provided an example here about Libet's finger-raising experiment, where people aren't really conscious of when they make a decision to do something, and it's very interesting. However, I thought that was interesting and wasn't too familiar with that particular study, so I did a little extra reading, and these links talk about research that's been done to test those theories and conclusions that came from that finger-raising experiment, and some of them somewhat contradict the idea that was determined here that people don't really know what they're doing. So there's not a whole lot of agreement about this, and there's a whole philosophical debate out there about what free will is and how much we have of it. So I will leave that to you to read that, but it's very interesting. It's a little deep, but those links are there for you. There was another similar study done with a cursor control where people, instead of moving their finger, were using a cursor. And again, they concluded that people maybe aren't always as clearly aware of their decisions and actions than they think they are, or we think they are. So there's more here in yellow. You can see more on the philosophical debate between free will and determinism. I found this interesting too, and I found a few links for you to read a little deeper if you'd like to. And I want to make sure we keep this relevant to our course and to teaching. There's a topic here, non-conscious control of personality, and are there unconscious agencies? So are there parts of our personality that are unconscious but still have free will? That seems a little contradictory. Keep in mind, based on our textbook anyway, that an agency is defined as part of the personality that exerts free will. But agencies are usually superparts that have many functional areas of personality working at the same time. So the id, the ego, and the superego don't necessarily work totally separately. They're working in concert to result in our actions. So the question is, how much of those actions are we really in control of or not? Or your students, how much are they in control of or not? One little somewhat related, it seems like a tangent here, but it's related to the idea of having a personality and a will, is the idea of alters and dissociative identities. And you'll probably all be familiar with the idea of multiple personalities in the movie Sybil, things of that nature, that talk about having multiple personalities that sometimes people manifest after a trauma. This diagnosis has actually changed in the new DSM. From older diagnoses, which were called multiple personality disorder. But the idea is where a person has two or more distinct identities that are separate from one another and have enduring patterns of personality, if you will, but they're not functioning together. And one or the other tends to take control of the person's behaviors. So that talks about the relationship, or addresses the idea between the personality affecting our actions. And there are big gaps in memory between those two identities that are too extensive to be explained by forgetfulness. So there's evidence that there really are two personality structures working within one person. There's some diagnostic information here for you all if you're interested in seeing how that diagnosis is given to people, and how it differs from historic use of the idea of multiple personalities. This is not something that's super common, but it's an interesting diagnosis, and it relates to the idea of coping and defense mechanisms. So it's definitely relevant to our topics in our course. A couple more slides here. We're almost done. One is self-determination theory is reviewed in the readings. And again, if we have free will and if we have self-determination or predetermination going on, both of those, those are concepts to think about in terms of what interventions matter. If everything's predetermined, it doesn't matter what you do for someone's outcomes. But if they have free will and self-determination, of course, you can provide people with opportunities and interventions to maximize their potential and to reach their maximum potential. So the question here is, to what degree do people own their own decisions? And those are affected by motivation. So if we can influence people's outcomes, we could do it with extrinsic motivation from outside, like grades, pay, affection, or intrinsic motivation, which is where people do things because it's rewarding to them in and of themselves. And there's a lot of interesting research about this that talks about how something we really like to do, like say someone really likes tennis, if you can almost take something you really enjoy doing, and if you start providing extrinsic motivation to do it, you can kind of take the intrinsic joy away. So that's something to think about as teachers. If someone has a real passion for something, you certainly don't want to provide work or interventions that squelch that passion if someone is about to, really master something. So it's kind of interesting application to teaching. There are different levels in the text described about self-determination, from being unmotivated, having no sense of motivation or capacity to fill out a task. That relates to the idea of agency, to being very intrinsically motivated and wanting to do something because they want to do it for the task's own sake. And I would like you, at the end of this unit or module, to think about what levels of self-determinism you see in your students and what you can do to improve their motivation and their outcomes in terms of their effort at whatever you're trying to have them learn in your class, the outcomes, their success, and their relationships. All right, I hope this helps you think about the concept of consciousness and teaching, and that you find the module interesting. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.